life. Is it sensible to tell him in advance that whatever he does militarily, we will rule out any form of military response? Now, Blair is not acting alone. He, of course, is representing British policy as he has his entire life. But to give you an idea of how utterly mad this policy is, we're going to introduce Americans to a figure that I don't think most Americans know anything about. His name is David Starkey. He's a British historian and imperialist. He appeared on a program called the Colin Brazier podcast episode. It was entitled Putin Represents a Return to Empire. And what happened was he got involved in a very peculiar discussion with the host, Colin Brazier. And what we're going to do is play that for you and comment briefly afterwards about the truly wacky and dangerous conception he puts forward.
And then finally, it seems to me, we've got to recognize, as I said, this extraordinary arrogance of the West, which led to a complete dropping of guard, right? But the fantasy that our way of life is a bit like McDonald's. It's for export and everybody wants it. This is a very, very important question. We've just had Tony Blair talking, and he couldn't keep his mouth shut, even a bit like me, really, except I'm not a Knight of the Garter. But Tony Blair saying, what we should be doing, the fact that we should be deploying power and effectively threats of power. Yes, that's all very well. But Tony Blair illustrated with his adventures in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the fundamental problem. There are societies which are not susceptible to the Western way of life. Our way of life, our notions of limited government, our notions of rights, our notions of free speech, our notions of tolerance are profoundly culturally rooted. They're rooted in our history.
Is it because we are such an accidental exception? Is there something remarkable that happened 400 years ago, perhaps attached to the Reformation, definitely attached to really boring commercial trading activities and legal safeguards and patents and all that stuff, which meant actually we think what we considered to be normal was exceptional?
It's totally extraordinary. And what is really striking, Colin, look at who is taking on Russia. It is really just the Anglosphere. In other words, it is basically, again, the book that I've been getting obsessed about because of its role in prophecy is George Orwell's 1984. Now, we think of 1984 simply as this terrifying study of the relationship between tyranny and totalitarianism and the individual. But it's also set in this extraordinarily conceived of frame of international relations in which the world has separated itself into three superpowers. One of them is Oceania, and Oceania is us and America. It's the British Empire and America. Orwell sees it as having gone ingsoc, having gone totalitarian socialist like the rest. It didn't. And it remains extraordinarily different. It's rooted in common law. It's rooted in the fact we're an island. America is an island. We're an island. One of the problems with the Ukraine is there are no frontiers. You're in this vast, infinite plain across which countries, powers, tribes have raced for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There are no frontiers. We in England have a frontier, the sea. America has a frontier, the sea. England has not changed its frontiers seriously since the Norman conquest.
So for those of you who have thought of yourself as being independent of the British Empire, he has news for you. You're not. You're part of something called Oceania, actually, the island nations, the island empire. And of course, this mad utopian outlook is one that is entertained by British elites, the British oligarchy. And in one sense, they are correct. They have largely subjugated Americans. largely through what we will call the empire of the mind, or what Winston Churchill referred to as the empire of the mind. And we don't mean simply Oxford and Cambridge. We're talking about the idea of culture and counterculture that became dominant, particularly after the 1960s. But there's a need for us to step beyond that localized, relatively recent cultural degeneracy coming after the Second World War, and look at this from a higher standpoint, the higher standpoint of tragedy. And in this case, what we're going to do is to refer to Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman, who in a piece that he wrote called The Historical Individual said this: in a time of crisis like today, the typically failed political leader, Tony Blair, for example, is like the narcissistic actor who poses for his audience from on stage or on camera while gloating sotto voce. Look at me. He is more or less indifferent to the reality of the circumstances under which he postures. The objective of his performance is like that of a prostitute prowling the tawdry street, merely seduction. And so in this world of tragedy that we have entered into, in which what you say actually matters, and fantasy ideas sort of powered by the sexual frustrations of old men should not be allowed to actually define life and death matters, whether that be through policies like economic sanctions or be through policies leading to nuclear war. It's necessary to have a different principled conception of humanity itself. And so in order for us to reinforce what that would be, we are introducing here a clip from Lyndon LaRouche from 1996, in which he gives us his conception of how he was attempting to intervene at that time on the American president, Bill Clinton, who, by the way, had just had his campaign, the second presidential campaign, co-opted by Tony Blair and by a faction of British intelligence that was sometimes referred to as Cool Britannia, the Third Way, and other names, but was British imperial policy just by another name. And Lyndon LaRouche was involved in intervening against that. And here is the chosen method that he was using.
As you may perceive, I'm not concerned so much with running for office, though I'm very serious about running for office. At my age, you cannot afford to waste time on things you're not serious about. But the point is, I'm not interested in some, people treat election campaigns like they were sports events. Who won the thing, who got the gold medal. And I don't know whether you call that gong show on the Republican side a sports event or not. It's all going to come down to dole. They're all going to be gonged out pretty soon. We had Phil Graham go to milligram and then to microgram and then to nanogram. But I'm in the process of making a revolution by trying to evoke from the American people a movement which is based on the kinds of things I've discussed. We got two problems. Number one, people say, let's blame government. Let's blame those in power. I know all about that. I've seen that. That's not the problem. The problem, people aren't willing to sacrifice something else, which I'll be dealing with this Saturday. The case of Hamlet, as I'll deal with it Saturday, just in passing and dealing with something else, which is advertised. Hamlet, the great tragedy, which is the tragedy of us all. We could call it the President Clinton as Hamlet. Now think about President Clinton as Hamlet, or a potential Hamlet, who can go down in blood the way Hamlet did in the drama. And think of Shakespeare as a great artist, not an entertainer, but a great thinker, a great artist, a master tragedian. Now here's Hamlet. Hamlet, you start this scene on the parapet. And these two guards are talking on the parapet of this Danish palace. And that's not Danish the kind you eat, it's another kind. And in comes Hamlet into the picture, and he thinks he sees the ghost of his dead father. And he wonders if the spirit I've seen is real or if it's some trick of the devil to deceive him. And you see in that moment the germ of a conflict. Then you come along toward the end of Act 2. And Hamlet has brought some players on to rehearse them to see if they can act this play about Hecuba. And the players leave and they've exhibited great passion. And he says, I wonder if this player here who just left the room here wept. Could he weep for Hecuba? Could I weep for Hecuba? What is Hecuba to him? Yet I peak like John at dreams, unpregnant of my cause, and can do nothing. I must be pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or I have fattened the region kites with his slaves often, referring to his enemies. Then it comes to the next act. There's an opening scene, and Hamlet goes to this famous soliloquy, to be or not to be. And there's a very interesting double play here goes on. To be or not to be, that's the subjunctive. That's not in the indicative case, mood. It's a subjunctive mood. This state or that state. To be or to be. Two different states of mind. What are the two states that we find out in the unfolding of this soliloquy? In one state, there's death. The bourne from which no traveler has returned. But that's not the only issue. It's not he's just afraid of dying in the struggle. Something else. To be dead or alive, or to be something else. We would rather bear the ills we have than those we know not. And so Hamlet, in this point, has made a decision to die. And he says to Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, go. I have nothing more to do with you. I'm dead, I'm doomed. I've made the decision to doom myself because I would rather bear the ills I have than those of which I know not. And that's typical American. That's Clinton as his pragmatic worst. Rather bear the certainty of winning the next election than worrying about the fate of the nation or the world. And it might come to the point he realizes, yes, maybe the world's monetary system is doomed, but I can't say that. I can deal with this because this is something I can understand, or my pragmatic friends in the DNC, or my campaign advisors can understand, or the Democratic Party, otherwise, or in the Congress. And I'm going to cling to these trodden, acceptable ways to win an election, even if it means the death of the United States. Because I dare not risk that which I do not understand. And that's the problem with most American people, not Clinton. Clinton is a leader. He's elected to be a leader. The nation is in great trouble, as was the nation of Denmark in the time of Hamlet. But Hamlet, who was the leader who might have changed the destiny of the nation, could not act because he could not go from the habitual to the unknown, the uncertain. And so that's Clinton's problem right now. That's his Hamlet problem, which I've got to get him out of because he's president. Otherwise the whole nation can go, as in the last act, the last scene of Hamlet. A bloody carnage, they're all dead. The problem lies with the people, because there's leadership and there's the people. Are the people willing to look in themselves and see what it was in them, which, as I've said repeatedly, step by step, drop by drop, drip by drip, over the past 30 years, the American people have drifted into conventions and accepted ways of doing things which have now brought us to the point of destruction. Not because Washington imposed it upon them, but because they voted for the people who did it. They voted to support the policies which they curse, whose results they curse. Can I get people to look in themselves and see the evil in themselves? The Hamlet in themselves. Because if I can't do that, I can't get the American people to make the kind of decisions which they must make in choosing leadership to get us out of this mess. They won't even respond to a competent leader. They would rather die as a nation than respond to a competent leader who challenges them to give up those habits of belief by which they are being destroyed.
Today, the world is clearly and arguably in an even more dire situation than the one that Lyndon LaRouche talked about in 1996. And the Hamlet problem is the one that is posed and plagues the entire world at this time. The world's not going to be able to continue in the way that it wishes. And in the course of the last weeks at the United Nations, there is an increasingly serious and sober discussion about the problem that the United Nations faces, which is its impotence to seemingly stop the path of thermonuclear war. We're going to play for you just an excerpt from one of the speeches that has been given in the last couple of weeks, just because it happens to be exemplary of the better elements of discussion. And this one was given by the representative of Venezuela to the United Nations.
Currently, less than a week since the onset of the conflict, we are heading dangerously towards a third level. That is an escalation between four nuclear powers, which, in changing their strategic security balances and attempting to destabilize one of them through an economic blockade, in this case the Russian Federation, could lead to the unleashing of a conflict of global proportions. This situation has no precedent in our history since the Second World War. Mr. President, in the current circumstances in Eastern Europe, security is a value which must prevail for all parties involved. The United Nations was established after the greatest war in history to guarantee the maintenance of international peace and security. Its greatest success has been avoiding a third world war. And even when it's not been possible to avoid armed conflict, the role of our organization through political negotiation has been to reverse conflict and to return to diplomacy for a peaceful resolution. And that is our duty today, to correct our path and to avoid going into a point of no return which will compromise the survival of present and future generations. We must work towards ending an escalation of tensions. Our role today is not to fuel tensions and divides at all three levels that I referred to, at the national, regional, and global level. The United Nations cannot be used to further fuel conflicts. We emphasize the fact that this is the only institution in the world with the capacity, the experience, and the instruments required to achieve a peaceful settlement of disputes of the magnitude we are witnessing today. There is a growing threat of a global conflict between nuclear powers. Because of all of this, and in order to get out of this labyrinth we are in today, we appeal to this General Assembly and to responsible members of the international community to address this crisis at three levels in a balanced fashion and very cautiously, so that we avoid furthering divisions. We therefore reject the implementation of unilateral and retaliatory coercive measures for economic, commercial, or financial purposes, because they will intensify the crisis and prolong the conflict. While mankind continues to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, a new global economic crisis is being imposed by design for the express purpose of generating suffering for hundreds of millions of people worldwide, a deliberately generated crisis in order to destabilize a nuclear power. This is not the path to peace.
How could the United States come to its senses, fully reject the pro-nuclear world war madness of global Britain and Tony Blair, David Starkey, and other imperial lunatics, and join Russia, China, and India in the creation of transcontinental development corridors to lift billions of people out of poverty and disease? This is a conception and conceptual design that did not only come from Lyndon LaRouche, but importantly, when Lyndon LaRouche in the 1980s was able to impact, influence, and convince President Ronald Reagan of the workability of the plan called the Strategic Defense Initiative, that began a process, both in the United States and with other nations, of discussion that has reached through various iterations and in various through various contributions of various people this moment. And in designing this, particularly in the past roughly decade and a half, Lyndon LaRouche was joined by many individuals from the LaRouche youth movement, and specifically what he created called the basement team. And it's important, I think, to just say, as we go to our presenter, Jason Ross, who is the co-author of several of the reports that we've written on the idea of the new Silk Road becoming the world land bridge, to pose for everyone that is watching here that any discussion about trying to get out of the present war circumstance without a discussion about a new economic platform through which security, a new security architecture could be guaranteed, any other discussion will end up sooner or later leading to the same tragedy that we are seeking to avoid. And so, to get our discussion started on this matter, I've asked Jason to join us and to do what he's been doing also, by the way, in an economic series, which I think we're going to get a chance to say a little bit more about a little bit later, which is done each Wednesday, I believe. But we'll get into that a bit in the questions and answers. And I hope to be joined a little bit later also by Diane Sayers. So, Jason.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. So one of the thoughts I think about an economic and security architecture, it raises the question of international law. And this is something that the Russian-Chinese document of February 4th, where the two leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, met in Beijing on the sidelines of the Olympics, they put forward a totally earth-shaking document that lays out the nature of the collaboration between these two countries. And one of the aspects of what they put out in that joint statement was an emphasis on international law rather than the rules-based order. We hear this phrase about the international rules-based order. Now, what is a rule? Who sets a rule? Does the ruler of the United Kingdom rule the world? There's a difference between rules and laws, you might say. Laws are actually passed by some sort of body that has the authority to make those laws, some ability to enforce them, and a mechanism to make sure that they'd be enforced in a uniform way, ideally, right? That's what gives law its validity. Or does it? So let me just start by thinking about what makes a law lawful. Certainly, we do pay a lot of attention to the manner by which laws are passed and debated, and people are elected to vote on and discuss proposed laws. You know, we have legislatures, we have executives, we have votes, we have committees, we have all these sorts of things. We have hearings, for people to give their input. And that gives a certain legitimacy, to, at least to some kind of a process by which laws are formally put on the books. But is that the only or best or only basis to determine whether a law is lawful? Now, for example, what's the difference between a law of Congress and a law of physics? Does Congress have the ability to pass laws that are stupid? Of course, there's plenty. Is it possible for what you might call a law of physics, although I don't really like that phrase, can it be wrong? Certainly. Everything that we think about the physical world is at least a little bit wrong. The authority of science lies not in the accuracy of its current discoveries, but in the process by which the boundaries of human knowledge are expanded, by the process that allows us to discover where we're wrong and to create a new and higher understanding. This is the real authority of science. So when you think about, a law of physics, unlike, for example, the second law of thermodynamics, which I don't consider lawful, their authority comes in their being discovered and in their resulting in a dialogue, in a process of discovery and discussion with the universe itself, through the form of creating crucial experiments where a hypothesis generated in the mind leads to carrying out some type of experiment to figure out whether you can make something new happen based on this principle that you believe represents some aspect of the physical world and how it unfolds and how it operates. So as far as the concept of natural law goes, let's apply that to politics, to statecraft, to economics. Are the laws that we should operate under, need they be discussed by groups that have an authority from sovereign governments, nation states, etc., to vote and debate on them and this kind of thing? Sure, that's an aspect of it. But I think the issue that most tellingly confronts us right now is, what is the authority for these laws? Do they have a basis in their goodness, their rightness, in the better kind of world that they're capable of helping to bring about? And I think that's sort of the highest level to look at it. Otherwise, you wind up with the inevitable questions of, is the international law truly a law if it's only applied in specific cases? For example, who winds up at the International Court of Justice? Who winds up at the International Criminal Court? Is international law something that we can say has been violated by Russia's actions in Ukraine? Well, sure looks like it. On the other hand, on what basis does this international law, on what basis can it be said to exist even as a law? Is George Bush, has he been put on trial? Is he imprisoned? Has he been on trial at The Hague for what he did in Iraq? How about Libya? How about Syria? How about stealing the $7 billion in reserves of Afghanistan? Have these actions been met with the forceful condemnation and rebuke under international law? No, they haven't. So part of creating a new security and development architecture is going to be revitalizing and giving a new fresh basis for the authority of international law by making it part of a program not only of security, recognizing everyone's security needs, but crucially of development, of growth. And this was an essential part of the ability of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 that ended the religious war in Europe. A major part of its ability to succeed came in its forward orientation of forgetting the past, that's important, of seeking justice in the future, in saying explicitly that the states would care about each other's interests and work for each other's interests going forward. And that's a real durable basis for an international security and development framework. So when we think about what it is that makes it possible for the different epochs of human history to follow from one another, what creates a new chapter in the history of human experience, a very large component of that comes from our new discoveries of principles that let us fundamentally transform our relationship to nature, to the surrounding world, and to each other, scientific and cultural discoveries. These occur in a way that cannot be modeled by or explained by non-living systems. Creativity, the resolution of paradox through metaphor, through the creation of a new hypothesis, almost always one that involves a new sort of language, a new kind of identity of thought object to resolve what, from a lower standpoint, appeared as a paradox. This is something that occurs uniquely in the human mind, that occurs in the human mind of the initial discoverer, and occurs in a good classroom, which isn't commonly the case, in the minds of the students, of the co-discoverers, of the learners, who, especially important if they're working together, come to recreate in their own minds that experience of fresh discovery that the first person who figured something out got to experience in the past. We've got a great repertoire of these things. We've got the excellent geometric work going back to Greece. We've got the great discoveries typical of the Golden Renaissance that exploded in Europe, leading into modern science, the discoveries of Cusa, of Kepler, of Fermat, of Gauss, of Riemann. We have these things at our fingertips, at our disposal. Maybe not at our fingertips, they're kind of tough. But we've got this whole repertoire that we can use to come better to understand the nature of scientific discovery. And this is a crucial aspect of economics. LaRouche firmly believed that you could not truly understand economics without an understanding from the inside of how this scientific progress operates. So I'm going to lay out a few ideas of his as he expressed them in a 2005 paper published in Executive Intelligence Review. This is from Lyndon LaRouche. It's called Vernadsky and Dirichlet's Principle on the Noetic Principle. Vernadsky was a Ukrainian-Russian biogeochemist who moved forward the work of biogeochemistry in Russia, who worked on the industrialization and development, particularly infrastructure in Russia, who helped get started the first nuclear laboratory work in Russia. And his understanding of how the living domain differs from the non-living created an analogy that LaRouche applies, as did Vernadsky, to understanding the difference between the cognitive world, the potential of human culture, human thought, and the living, or even the non-living. A couple examples of this are that living processes, Vernadsky said that in approaching the study of life, look not only at what, is life and defining it, what are the features of a living organism and so on, but also look at on a geological view, what are the geological effects of life? What does life do as a geological phenomenon? What does the human mind do as a geological phenomenon? Life created, for example, the oxygen catastrophe. As life on the planet developed from using only terrestrial resources, the chemoautotrophs, the first living organisms on our planet that lived off of chemicals, like the deep sea vent creatures that you might see on a nature program, were living within the crust of the earth. Life made a move to use off the planet power, to use extraterrestrial energy. And I don't mean anything so exotic and unusual. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, it's the sun. The development of photosynthesis let life on the earth tap into this enormous body quite far from the earth, use that energy to develop and grow. It took off amazingly. Part of the effect of that is that photosynthesis creates a lot of oxygen. So the oxygenation of the atmosphere, which then formed minerals that simply could not have existed on the pre-photosynthetic Earth, this transformed the geology of the planet entirely. We know also of formations of things that we use today, like petroleum formations or coal, this sort of thing. Those are some of the ones that we think about. But many mineral concentrations, many ores that we mine and use today productively for economic purposes, result in life having concentrated various elements for its own purposes, leaving behind deposits that now our economies are able to make use of. This includes even things like iron ores, calcium, things like this, limestone. So there's a way of looking at what life does. Similarly, cognition, what we do. We have an impact on the biosphere and on the geosphere, on the earth, on the crust of the earth, that goes far beyond the physical activities of our bodies. Like animals, we eat food and have children and excrete substances we don't need or want anymore. But the real impact that we have on the earth is far beyond any of these things. It began with the use of fire, with the terraforming of the earth, the creation of infrastructure projects for water, for example, for drainage, for irrigation, the creation of new forms of life through the work of agriculturalists improving native species of plants, like corn on the cob. It's a nice thing to have at dinner. The initial corn that came from was short, the size of your hand. And breeding over generations made it much more delicious. Same with all sorts of fruits, vegetables, animals as well. Think about what's been done, horses, dogs, for example, cats, and oxen, things like this. So we've had a tremendous impact on the biosphere through the creation of what can be recognized as noetic fossils. If a volcano were to erupt, as has happened, and you look through the, what's underneath it, and you find a city, you find books, even if you don't find human bodies, maybe everybody evacuated. But based on what you see as fossils, you can say it's obvious that minds existed, MINDS, minds existed at this place because we see the fruits of cognition. So some of the largest aspects of this come in an increase in what LaRouche says is best to call energy flux density, or conveniently called energy flux density. So let me differentiate that from energy use or energy density for a moment. It's true that we've definitely increased our energy use per person and per area of our cities and habitations and all of this. But the greatest importance in this isn't just that we use increasing amounts of energy over time, but it is changes in the quality of that energy. So the initial use of human beings using far more energy than animals, in the sense that we have energy besides what we ingest, you look at fire. Human beings use fire. A dog might enjoy curling up to one, but dogs don't create fires, spread them, use them to clear land, to cook their meat, to scare off animals that might eat them, to boil water, to work materials, to make stones easier to chip, any of these things. Forget it. Animals don't do that. So fires are use of energy. We use trees, burn them, etc. But no matter how much of a fire you build, you can't run a computer. No matter how many wood fires you put somewhere, or how much wood you have to burn, you're going to have a very hard time using that to create a transportation network. Coal really made trains possible, not only because it was so much cheaper in physical terms to get than having to get so many trees. It had more energy within it. The amount of energy it was able to contribute to the process of locomotion was greater. So energy flux density, think about how much energy, so flux is a term for what's passing through a given area. So, you shine a flashlight, there's a certain amount of energy coming out of that bulb, and it really spreads out. A laser with the same amount of energy as a flashlight bulb might be able to cut something because the beam is extremely condensed. It operates over an extremely small area. So even if the laser has the same energy as a flashlight, especially an old flashlight where so much of the energy is just heating the filament, when that energy is concentrated and over a very tiny area with a laser, that's an example of a higher energy flux density, an intensity of energy use. This characterizes human development, the chapters in the human saga. One other way to think about this is that condensing everything to energy really misses a certain very important point. LaRouche says in this paper, he says, just because, for example, you can measure the height of people and dogs and horses with a yardstick, doesn't mean that people, horses, and dogs are all types of yardstick. That might sound a little bit silly, but that's exactly what people do with energy. And partly this is a great discovery, that thermal energy and mechanical energy, they have a relationship, as Watt showed. That's important. But a certain amount of energy expressed as the chemical energy of wood that you might burn versus that same amount of energy when expressed through an extremely condensed and intense laser that's able to cut through a thick piece of steel, they're not the same amount of energy. In terms of what it is able to achieve, the quantity of energy is insufficient for understanding the uses to which a process that uses a certain amount of energy can achieve. The energy flux density is what's absolutely essential there. And the way that we have developed these scientific breakthroughs that offer us the new principles to refine our power and improve it, this comes not through logic, and this will be my second to last point here, is that logic is not how discoveries are made. The Aristotelian thinking, Aristotle wrote books about science and so forth, and they're kind of silly. He had a bunch of assumptions about how the universe worked. They weren't very good. And a large part of his writing was laying out all these givens, and then a great deal of it was also about logic. How, from things that we already know, can we derive conclusions that we can feel confident in expressing on the basis of the initial assumptions and the reasoning by which we arrived at those conclusions. So this deductive process where there's givens, let's leave those aside for a minute. How, from things that we know, can we make justifiable conclusions of other things that we say, hey, this should also be the case? So supposedly, as the story goes, great thinkers much later realized that you should actually, do experiments and look at things to figure out what's true. Francis Bacon, for example, is credited with introducing the modern scientific method, where essentially you have to actually, do experiments and figure out what actually is true. You need to focus on those givens, not as givens, but as the results of a discovery, of an induction. He really wasn't the first person to think of this. It's kind of obvious in a certain sense. And if we take a look at how Kepler did exactly that already, Johannes Kepler, the great astrophysicist who discovered how the planets move, who hypothesized the forces that cause the motions of the planets, and who forced his contemporaries to drop a mathematical approach to the heavens. This is what Kepler did. So before Kepler, people said, the planets move in circles because circles are uniform and the heavens must be uniform. And even Copernicus, known as putting the sun at the middle of the solar system, he totally freaked out and rejected the idea of non-uniform motion. To him, circles upon circles upon circles were the way to understand motions. That's a silly approach. And Kepler said, this is absurd. Circles don't cause motion. They might describe a motion if you have like a wheel or a circle, but these planets, they're not, stuck on spokes of a wheel. There's something else going on out there. And he had an idea of gravitation and magnetism, and not all of his physical ideas were right. But he had an approach that said we must hypothesize, use our minds to create an idea of the causes of what drives nature out there, of discovering principles, and then validating those and then using them to improve our knowledge. When this is done, you take contradictory sense impressions, so to speak. You take data that contradict each other, and you resolve them not by kind of a mush or a best fit, but by accepting that the paradoxes that you're encountering are true paradoxes that reflect the failure of a current system of thought, of a current theorem lattice of ideas about how nature works. That is a failure. We've discovered that failure through a paradox, and we must now hypothesize a new framework, a new principle, under which this paradox simply doesn't exist anymore. We resolve it in that way, in something higher. I'll just give one example of that. And this comes on following up on the work of Kepler, because Kepler had a principle of change. Each moment, the planet's speeds and distances would change based on how close they were to the sun and some other ideas that Kepler had. Every moment, the planet is changing its speed. How then can you figure out exactly how its path operates? There was a problem. Kepler could calculate it as well as he liked, but his math wasn't capable of understanding this exactly. That problem was partly solved by Gottfried Leibniz, who invented the infinitesimal calculus in order to make change itself a reality. Okay? To bring change into the language of mathematics. And when he did that, he did it through a new language that was paradoxical, specifically through his use of the infinitesimal. Leibniz invented a new concept, an infinitesimal, an intent towards change, which is bigger than nothing. It's not nothing, but it's smaller than any actual existence. If you have an intent to grow, if from one moment to the next something is growing, right at that moment, it hasn't grown yet, so there's no specific amount bigger that it has gotten, yet it's not static. It has an intent to grow. This amphibian living in between not being and being was the kind of metaphorical extension of language that really characterizes a fundamental discovery of principle. So the hypothesizing aspect, the creation of new ideas, this is the most key component to seeking paradoxes, resolving them through hypotheses. This is not induction. This is not the same as what's presented as the scientific method today. It's not what you put on your backboard in school, although those things are not unimportant. But the real key, hypothesizing, is sort of set aside with all of this. So in implementing a security and development architecture for the planet, we need to have peace. We need to have a commitment not to have conflict and to respect everybody's security concerns. That's true. We have to have an idea of where we're headed. Where are we going? To what end would we implement such an architecture? What are the goals of the human race, of the cultures and nations and states that we live in? And for that, we have to think about the anti-entropic potential of each human being and of every human action. The real economic value of some productive or scientific process lies not simply in its physical effects of producing widgets or screws or tables or lamps or any of these things. The real question is always, well, to what end are those products put? Into what process are those inputs or outputs? Into what process are these goods contributing? Where are we headed? And so then that sends your mind up to space, up to what we can discover and be able to do up there, off this planet, beyond this planet, to the newest breakthroughs of energy flux density, namely nuclear fusion, towards extremely high power lasers, for example, capable over an extremely short period of time of concentrating a flow of energy as great as that on average flowing through all the electrical lines in the US, for example, at a moment. We have a laser that has that amount of power concentrated for an extremely short period of time. And this brings us to a smaller, more intense domain of physics, of what's occurring in the extremely small. These are the real frontiers that we need to reach out to together. And as we conquer and defeat this oligarchical menace that has troubled humanity for far too long, as we eliminate this British Empire, this geopolitical view that sees another's gain as one's loss, with this swept away, we can put in place a real mission for progress, a real mission for growth. So for that, let me just read the last sentence of this, last paragraph of this paper by Lyndon LaRouche. He says, actually, I'm going to read the last two paragraphs. Okay, 3. It's a very good paper. Since 1789, LaRouche writes, the principal alternative to the Anglo-Dutch liberal model has been what is known as the American system of political economy, a system which is implicit in the composition of the U.S. federal constitutional republic. If the U.S. now comes back to its senses, pulling back from the terrible Holocaust which the architects of the American oligarch George Pratt Schultz's Bush II administration have unleashed, we have a chance to stop the plunge towards global hell. If we succeed in doing that in the USA itself, with whatever cooperation we might find for that noble enterprise, the mission of a community of perfectly sovereign nation states will be to use the U.S. revolutionary model of 1789 as the rallying point for a system of international cooperation among sovereign states, a system we might have had, but for President Franklin Roosevelt's most untimely death. Then, he concludes, the ideas associated with Vernadsky's conception of biosphere and noosphere will provide a needed added guidance for new global forms of cooperation among sovereign commonwealths. Then, the ideas expressed and otherwise reflected in the foregoing pages will become a possible reality for mankind as a whole. We need a mission of growth, and LaRouche's outlook in parallel or conjunction with, in dialogue with the work of Vladimir Vernadsky and understanding what is the power of the human mind, provide a real roadmap for laying out the objectives and charting an economic course for the world over the generations to come. And having an idea of that is a crucial part of being able to succeed in laying out what new security and development architecture the world needs at present.
Thanks a lot, Jason. And we're going to want to come back to you to have a bit more discussion, particularly about this issue of Vernadsky and this idea of a Vernadsky conference, which has been something that's been sort of being discussed among some of us, which we'd like to see go ahead. But we have Diane Sayre, who has graciously consented to substitute for Harley Schlanger, who apparently lost his voice somewhere along the, I don't know if it was around the Rhine or what he did, but Diane's here with us. And she stepped in and she's got some comments, among other things. Okay. Diane?
Great. Yes. Can you hear me? Is my volume okay?
Yeah, it's all right. You're all right.
Let me just, I realized I should have checked it. I have this peculiar coming at 12%, but if you hear me, I'll go ahead. I think, Jason, what you just presented is really important because we are now under the most unbelievable wartime propaganda that I've seen in my 35 years as a political organizer. And we've had pretty heavy propaganda. People remember in 1990, after the Berlin Wall came down, and remember Lyndon LaRouche was in prison at that time, but he and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, his wife, had a whole perspective to take that moment of the collapse of the Soviet system and take a springboard, take the industrial power of the West and develop the entire East. But instead you had Margaret Thatcher, George Bush Sr., with another idea, which was a series of wars, the invasion of Panama, war in the Balkans, and Saddam Hussein was lured into invading Kuwait by our ambassador, April Glaspie, who told him that if he did invade Kuwait, the United States would do nothing about it. And then people who were old enough will remember we were told all these stories, and there were videos of Iraqi soldiers ripping babies out of incubators and so on. Now we have that kind of propaganda over the current military action in Ukraine, excepting it's tenfold in terms of just trying to make everyone completely hysterical. And even people who don't believe it, nonetheless, find themselves getting very unnerved, wondering, where will this end? And I think, and what are we fighting? What should we be looking for? What should the policy be? And I think it's almost as if you're carried out to sea by a riptide and your feet can't touch the bottom. There's nothing there around which to orient. You're not being given that. There's no leadership. And I think, therefore, this question of what is the human identity and how do you measure human progress in the terms that Lyndon LaRouche defined as a development, if you will, on the work of Vernadsky is absolutely critical, because once you have in mind a metric of the development of the human species, then you have an ability to make sense of what's being presented to you, because you can hold it up to this conception of where we should be, what should be appropriate human behavior, what should be the appropriate human standard of living, and you can see where it falls short. And I think this is also very urgently needed in order to realize how horrifically the rights of the people living in the West have been violated. And I don't mean merely our freedom of speech or getting banned from Twitter or Facebook, all of which is part of this, but also what we've come to accept as a standard of living. What you walk through. I was in Manhattan this morning at a food distribution line. I mean, first of all, these are now all over the city. On any given day, you can find hundreds and hundreds of people lining up to receive food. Thank God it's there for them to receive. Well, not only did you have this long line, but there was garbage all over the street. And then you walk a couple blocks and there's people who are clearly homeless sitting in the streets. And you've heard the phrase, this is supposed to be the quote unquote new normal. So rather than recognizing that this is absolutely insane, it is a total violation of the rights of the people of this country for anyone to be living that way, people come up with kind of piecemeal approaches. Now, what I think is also missed in the West is that when China announced the Belt and Road Initiative and Xi Jinping announced his intention that there would be no more extreme poverty in China by 2020, which they successfully did, and that the world should unite to ensure that there is no extreme poverty anywhere in the world by 2050. Once you take that as an objective, then in a sense you have a rock under your feet. You have a metric whereby you can look at your policies and see if you're moving in the right direction. I have an idea that we have to plan for the United States to have 1 billion people and the planet probably about 25 billion people. And we should be building the infrastructure and the energy grid and the water systems for that now, because you want to have created the infrastructure for that population in the future. A few years ago, I had occasion, as people know, founded the Institute Chorus, New York City Chorus, and we were having large rehearsals in 2017 for a tribute to Sylvia Olden Lee at Carnegie Hall. And we were working with many, many other choruses who had to come in from all over the place. And people would be late often, not because they started too late, but because they didn't count on being delayed for 3 hours because there was a fire in the subway or some other kind of crazy disaster. I mean, you literally had situations where the trains would just stop and people would be getting off and walking very dangerously through the subway tunnels to get out. So I attended a conference about the subway system, what to do. And I was seated at a table with a group of engineers, and I was talking to them about some of the ideas of our late friend Hal Cooper, the rail genius who was working on New York as connected to the Bering Strait tunnel. And they all looked completely shocked. They had not even been thinking on these terms. They had been behavior modified by budget constraints. So that, and then what was presented there were various ideas like, as people know, they've been trying to take the land that the Rikers Island prison complex is on and either turn it into an extension of LaGuardia Airport or something else. Not one single project that was presented was designed for population growth. Not one. And that's when we know that Penn Station was built, or Grand Central Station, was built to handle, I think, 250,000 people a day. And prior to COVID, it was handling 650,000 people a day. And you know that one of the problems of the New York metropolitan region is that the infrastructure that is here was built at a time when the population using it might have been a third or so of what it is currently. And therefore there is no redundancy. That is, if you had to close the tunnels, the rail tunnels under the Hudson River for repair and direct everyone to take a car, all of the bridges, the George Washington Bridge and the tunnels that you drive through, not the rail tunnels, would become parking lots. There's no redundancy. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which I always joke about because it's been under construction for I guess 35 or 37 years now. And I don't know how that could be. I guess it's not finished. But they've determined that after these 35 years, it's now crumbling and the traffic weighs too much. So what they decided to do was to close a lane. Well, that's great. So instead of moving 20 miles an hour, you can move 2 miles an hour. And so you can understand, frankly, if people are living in these conditions where they have habituated themselves to accept the idea that not only is there not going to be any growth, but you can presume that the infrastructure you're depending on to exist will get worse from one year to the next. And the amount of debt you are burdened with will increase from one year to the next. And the price of food will increase, and the price of fuel. You can see how this all contributes to the population having an extremely difficult time to deal with reality, or to even consider what Jason has presented and what really we need people to be thinking about, which is where we should be going. What should New York City be like? I was riding with someone yesterday through the city. We were stuck in traffic, and they just said, can you imagine what a good landscaper could do with this? And I was struck. It had never occurred to me. Driving down the West Side Highway, you see all this bramble and trash and large encampments where homeless people are living, and you just presume that it looks horrible, like the place maybe went through a nuclear war or something, and that's all that's left. But actually, with not even a huge amount of work, the place could become aesthetically pleasing and beautiful. So this is really critical. And when LaRouche was forecasting, when I talked to him back in 2017 about this subway situation, and Jason also was involved in that, he said, well, you need a committee, and the way you need to think about it is what will happen if nothing is done. That is, imagine in your mind, create an experiment in your mind, where is the result of no action being taken? And I could imagine some catastrophe where there's massive loss of life, for example, or a total shutdown that creates chaos. And then he said, so explore that, talk to experts, talk to people who know. But then you also have to think about where you should be, because the point is you will never get from where you are to where you should be by doing an extrapolation of stepwise motion from what you think you know. You have to have a hypothesis in your mind about what the system should look like, about this idea of the United States having 1 billion people. Perhaps we'll discover that we can't really rebuild Manhattan in the current form, that we're going to have to get 2/3 of the population out of there into another city that we're going to build from the ground up nearby, and do a massive rebuilding of Manhattan, and then people can either come back or not. Maybe we'll have a bunch of it turned into parks and opera houses. These are the things that people have to think about. And if you're thinking from that standpoint, and then you look at what's happening in Ukraine, in a sense, necessity that was forced on Putin by the willful actions of the West to provoke this, first by putting Nazis in power in Ukraine, then destroying the economy of Ukraine with their economic policies, and then continuing this genocidal process in the East that killed 14,000 people, and ignoring everything that Putin said were legitimate security concerns, forced a certain action. Well, the question is, how do you get out of this? How do you solve this? Where should mankind be? And I think if we had much more discussion and thought from that standpoint, which is why the conference that's proposed for April 9th and the appeal put out by the Schiller Institute are so critical, that we would find ourselves able to put our feet on a rock somewhere, get some grounding, get rid of some of the hysteria and anxiety, and put the pieces together in a way to get mankind actually to where we should be going. On the one hand, it's very difficult. There's an enormous amount of work that we have to do. On the other, as everyone knows, when you make a discovery, the change in thinking is infinitesimal, in the twinkling of an eye, as they say. And that's the fight. And that's where you have to have a certain amount of faith, because we don't know, and it is not directly under our control where this change or when this change will occur. But we have to do everything we can to get that to occur. And then when it does, we have to make sure that we don't miss it.
Thank you, Diane. I want to, we have questions for Jason already, but there's something I want to pose by putting the thumbnail we began with, the picture of the World Land Bridge up again, and just saying this. And Jason, I'm going to ask you to tell us something about it, but before you do that, let me just indicate to people that the conception of this idea of a potential for such world land bridges came from Abraham Lincoln's and his allies' creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. And when you talk about the One Belt, One Road of today's Xi Jinping, you're talking about something that was extensively discussed in Philadelphia in 1876 by people from Russia, from Brazil, and from other countries who got the idea that transcontinental railroads could be built. And this was, of course, something like an Apollo project back at the time of the 1860s and 1870s. Now, there was a man who was one of Lincoln's allies. He was a congressman, and his name was William Kelly, an Irishman, also known as Pig Iron Kelly. He was one of the founders of the Republican Party in 1856. I think we have a picture of him, which we should put up so people can see him, because I've got some words of his in a speech he gave, which was after the conclusion of the American War of the Rebellion, sometimes mistakenly called the Civil War. Gave this speech in New Orleans, and here's what his speech said. He was speaking to a large African American audience, as well as the white population of New Orleans. And he said, "You men of color, you citizens of Louisiana who wear the livery of Africa's burnished sun, give thanks unto God that he has turned and overturned, until the humblest of you stands erect in the majesty of free manhood, the equal of your fellow man before the laws of your country, as you are before the beneficent Father of all. Freedom is his last best blessing to you. Maintain it by sleepless vigilance and by any requisite sacrifice. See to it that a common school system, broad enough as is that of the North, to embrace every child born in the Commonwealth or brought into it by emigration, is established by the Constitution soon to be framed for your state. See to it that the press is free, and be tolerant of opinion, for by the collision of opinion is the truth elicited. Welcome among you the people of every clime and nation, and remember that the prosperity of the state is but the aggregate prosperity of the individual citizens. Will you not do this?" And then everyone begins to yell, "Yes, yes, we will." And he says, "I know you will. And as this assurance thrills me, I behold a vision grander than that of Columbus. For I know that behind the islands lies a broad continent, sweeping from the rock-bound coast of the storm-lashed Atlantic to the golden shores of the sleeping Pacific. And that from the Rio Grande to the perpetual snows of Mount Hood, it is inhabited by one people who, though differing in origin, are homogeneous in language, thought, and sentiment, and who, though the citizens of many states, each having its own constitution, recognize as supreme one government, and that the freest yet devised by man. I cannot better illustrate the value of this unity than by pointing to the future of your own beautiful city, New Orleans. It is the entry point for the commerce of the Gulf, the trade of which proceeds under our bright flag. The river that winds around you carries to the sea the waters of 60,000 miles of river course. The valley it drains will sustain a population of 500 millions of people. They will be free, intelligent, enterprising, and given to commerce. And your city will be the center of their great commercial exchange. So that was a vision of William Kelly of the idea of the Mississippi Delta and Mississippi River Basin holding 500 million people in 1867, that he said that would be the future of that area. That idea that freedom was linked to development has always been the very center of the idea of the American system. And so I wanted to go back to the illustration because, Diane, you referenced Hal Cooper, who was the designer of that map that we're showing. And at the same time, Jason, when you, I'd like you to respond to say, what are we really looking at? Because of course, people are seeing blue lines in general, and they're broad. But is that like just a rail system? Is that a highway system? What do we mean by a development corridor? So, Diane, I just thought you might want to go first because you happen to mention Hal and say something about him and this design and the conversations that you had with him about that.
Well, I actually think Jason may want to take this up, who has done all the work on how the geography of the nation changes based on or seems to change, and not just the nation, but the world, based on your mode of transportation, how many days or weeks or months it takes you to get from point A to point B, and then how do you think about your quote-unquote location based on transportation times. I find it very useful to look at that. I'll just say, if you think about the Belt and Road of China, they're talking about connectivity, and they're particularly talking about ports and then moving goods from one population center to the next. If you look at the United States and you consider our port cities, most of them are in absolutely horrible condition. These all, for I think fairly obvious reasons, maybe not, were major industrial centers. Take Baltimore, steel. Take Camden, the shipyards. Take the port of Elizabeth, the West Coast, similarly Los Angeles, New Orleans, Chicago, ports on rivers, ports on the Great Lakes. Since we don't produce, there's nothing going on in these cities, and they've become very destroyed, and we have a flourishing drug trade, which is very devastating to the population. But if we were to actually consider revitalizing this question of connectivity from our ports inland and what we're going to produce and what we're going to be needing to move from inland out to the ports, I think you begin to imagine the transformation that would occur. And then when you go back and you look at these rail lines and you think about what they would be part of, they're not a thing in isolation. That's why LaRouche actually asked that we change this idea of infrastructure to platform, because it doesn't do you any good to have a port that's connected to nothing. There has to be something, an organism, something in a sense almost with a living quality that it's connected to. And so when you look at the rail system, you can see that as a skeleton, or you can see it as a cardiovascular system of something that is living, of which that's the part. So that's what I'm thinking about when I see that, and I know Jason has more.
Well, some of, in the mid-2000s, LaRouche really was, I think this is maybe when he was first switching over to this insistence on talking about infrastructure platforms instead of just the infrastructure itself. And part of what he was polemicizing against at that time was globalization. And I'll come back to the broader infrastructure thing. But part of the idea behind what was called globalization at that time was that companies could make more money by shifting labor, shifting production to countries where it was financially cheaper, and they could thereby increase their financial profits. So find places where labor is poorly paid, move your production there, maybe even move your whole factory there, and you'll come out financially ahead. Now, LaRouche said, well, is this a financial profit? Is this a physical economic profit? Is this a global profit? I mean, what does profit mean? This word gets really abused sometimes. For example, when you consider financial profit to be the same kind of thing as a physical economic profit, you can make money without doing anything useful. In fact, you can make money by doing things that are downright harmful. However, the idea of physical profit from having developed a new industrial technique, a new technology, you've applied a new scientific principle to improve your ability to produce something that contributes to humanity in a way that involves less human labor, well, that's a physical profit. And one of the biggest aspects of increasing the productive powers of labor, our ability to be physically economically productive, one of those is through the machine tool principle, through the actual development at the point of production. The other side of it is through infrastructure, which creates the substrate, the platform within which these productive processes unfold. Just one example from biology, think about, we're warm-blooded creatures, right? We're able to control our temperature to make sure that if it's really hot outside, we can sweat. If it's really cold, we can shiver and do things and change to, keep ourselves warm. That provides a platform biologically to have a lot of processes within our body that depend on certain temperatures, and we can count on that. And then we can have those productive processes, so to speak, within the platform of a warm-blooded organism that simply could not exist in, like a fish or a lizard or a spider, something like this, where they can't count on having that developed environment within themselves that's at just the right conditions for them. I mean, imagine thinking, reptiles, they kind of hibernate, or when it's cold, they basically fall asleep. Imagine if that happened to your brain. It's winter, you go outside and you stop thinking. I mean, that would be you couldn't have cognition on that kind of a biological infrastructure platform. So LaRouche found this very important. He said fully 1/2 of the physical expense of a country should be on infrastructure, on developing that platform. And so this means things like, as we saw with these development corridors, these blue lines, this would mean something like a high-speed rail line along with a roadway, along with regional rail as well, water, energy lines, natural gas perhaps, telecom lines, all this kind of thing, so that you're not only speeding the ability of connecting one city to another, the question is, what do you do in between? So for example, let's say we have some huge breakthrough in ocean shipping and we're able to bring a ship from Shanghai to Los Angeles in like a day. Let's say it goes much quicker than they currently do. You'd say, well, that could help trade between Shanghai and LA, but what about everything in between? What's it doing along the way in the ocean? Nothing. The big change with land transportation is that when you build that network, you build this development corridor, you're improving the ability to get from point A to B, sure, but also point C and D and E and F and G and everything in between. So that land becomes more valuable. The people who live there become more valuable, not just financially, I mean physically. Whatever you're able to produce there, you can now easily get it to, let's say, these big cities. Maybe you're going to make a new big city here. You can now be part of a broader productive process. Perhaps you're going to make one component of something, and then you're going to ship it over here for further processing. It's going to be shipped here to put into the final assembly. Sometimes now this is done with a broad network spanning the world. This part's made in this country, it's then shipped over here, or people make fun of something like, like pears, a little plastic cup of pears. The pears are grown in Argentina and then they're packed in Thailand and then you buy them in a store in the US. Sometimes it seems a little bit like maybe that's too much. But for real capital goods, this is a huge thing. This is what made the Midwest become so potentially productive, was through the rail networks there. It was really possible to say, hey, I'm going to produce this and I can ship it here easily and they can get it and they can use it for this and that. And so you end up being able to have more social complexity in production, which is very important. So you're able to move things quickly, you're able to move things easily in terms of the physical efforts required to get things around, and then you've got the land and people along the way with a greater access to that improved platform. Now you've got processes that can spring up productively there. And one of the biggest issues that Lynn had with globalization was that, people were poorly paid for doing the same labor that somebody used to get a union salary for in, say, the United States, but also that the amounts paid were not enough to then come through taxes or fees or what have you to really build up the infrastructure in a certain area. So the physical productive process might actually be less efficient under globalization than it would in an area, say the Midwest, where there's lots of transportation, energy, etc. So that financial profits were being made even when physical profits, when there was a physical loss. So I think infrastructure brings up both of those issues, both the need for, and look, the real profit, the real economic value, let's put it that way, it can't end at the point of production. It has to end, or it has to be looked at as contributing towards that social process of growth. You're producing food. That's great. So glad. What's wrong with producing food? Well, you get these people in like an ethics class or something saying like, what if, your food was feeding Hitler and therefore it was actually bad to be a farmer, or this kind of thing. That stuff gets a little bit silly, but it is true that, let's look at it on the positive side. You're a farmer. What are the people who are eating your food doing? Are they creating the next nasty Netflix special, the depressing kind of TV show or something? Are they instead working on a space program? Are they working on fusion research? What are the people who are eating your food doing? And that's part of the value of what you are doing with yourself. So the infrastructure is key on that, on making productivity. And a big part of that also is the social infrastructure. What is the education like? Are people learning, our kids, our students learning about the process of discovery during all their years in school, recreating those great breakthroughs of the past, those aha moments, reliving those, or you learning to repeat things? I think that's part of infrastructure as well.
Okay. Before we go to our first question, Jason, I'd like you to say a little bit about the class that you're doing on Wednesday and let people know how they can participate.
Sure. So this is particularly for people who are new to LaRouche, but not only, but there is a 8-part Introduction to LaRouche class series that's taking place. It's ongoing right now. We just had our fourth, I think, I hope I'm not wrong on that, our fourth class in that. You can learn more about it at thelarouche.org, the LaRouche organization, thelarouche.org/intro. Maybe we can pull that up. I hope so. thelarouche.org/intro. And you can register for the class there. And look, here we go. You'll be able to sign up and get the emails sending you to the future classes. And you can check out the ones that have already taken place. Next week's class, beautiful. Next week's class, there we go, is going to be on the American Revolution, the creation of our republic. Chris Sayre at the LaRouche organization is going to be leading that class about the intent of the American Revolution and of the American system of economics. It's going to be a lot of fun. So you can join us there, thelarouche.org/intro.
Question we have is from Kynan. He says, thank you for your excellent presentation. I want to go back to what Lynn was talking about in the video when he was attempting to intervene on the Clinton administration. We have the same kind of problem today where people are stuck in their habitual ways of thinking and are unable to make that leap to overthrow their axiomatic assumptions, which is exactly what doomed Hamlet, as Lynn pointed out. But the whole point of the new security and development architecture, which the Schiller Institute has proposed, is for people to overthrow the very geopolitical mistakes which have brought us to this crisis. How can we get people today who are stuck in their misguided prejudices about Putin and Russia's actions, for example, to think on the level which is required for bringing about a new security and development architecture for the world. So maybe you'll take that first, Jason, and then we'll go to Diane.
Sure. Well, I mean, Kynan, you've had a fair amount of experience with this, of getting people out of their axioms, so you might have some ideas yourself of what you've found to be effective and what isn't. I mean, one thing is, frankly, just telling the truth in a time like this, it might almost seem novel. I mean, people hear almost nothing but one viewpoint expressed across all the media right now. I mean, you see these clips from the White House press conferences where journalist after journalist is asking Jen Psaki, can't we attack Russia? Are you sure Biden's not for a no-fly zone? What would change Biden's mind? Couldn't we send in more weapons? How about some planes? What's the big deal with sending some planes? How about some Patriot missiles? I mean, there's just this drumbeat for war. And the idea that Putin acted in this unprovoked way in his operation in Ukraine, of course, none of that's true. We know Putin expressed exactly why he was doing this. He laid out proposals back in December saying, these are my security concerns. These are the treaties I want to sign with NATO, with the United States. It's not a surprise. I mean, the specific things are kind of surprising, you might say, but it's not unprovoked, and it's not impossible to figure out why this happened. This isn't the actions of a madman. And I think sometimes even just exposing people to that, it's like people have never even heard of any of this stuff. So in a certain sense, it's a little bit simple to actually really start to get into that. And always, the jokes work. I mean, contradictions in the form of jokes are good, but there's so many paradoxes within this bizarre narrative that pointing them out is the way to help get thoughtful people to realize, wait a minute, my views contradict each other. I disagree with myself. I have to figure out who's right. Is this idea of mine right? Is this idea of mine right? Maybe they're both wrong. So, things like there's this idea right now that Russia is going to be committing some attack using chemical weapons, which of course there's no reason for Russia to do this. It's as silly as Syria. But that's a live sort of threat right now, and it's something that's easy to make fun of. But I think the biggest thing is really having a sense of what could be. Because it's not as though, if we just stop this conflict, then everything will be great. Everything wasn't great. Everything's not great. If let's say that tomorrow Zelensky and Putin shake hands, hug, have a shot of vodka, and say, we're at peace, there's no problems. There are problems. We still have a financial system that's imploding, that's collapsing, that's causing hyperinflation. The prices are soaring. In Europe and the U.S., the transatlantic, the Anglo-American financial area. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And I think the excitement about what could be done, and I think awakening in people's minds, their conscience, or the power in their soul to be more courageous than they thought they were, to know more than they thought they could, is what really, really recruits people, acquainting people with that part of themselves that maybe they didn't know that they even had, and that they will then want to defend. That you have got a soul and a potential, and you're not going to throw it away. You're not going to compromise.
Okay, Diane?
There's not much to add from what Jason said, excepting I think that one thing that people can do to liberate their ability to think is to talk to other people. I think we've been horribly impacted by the pandemic, by the isolation, by people mediating their relationships with other people through social media or even texts or Facebook Messenger, as opposed to an actual conversation even on a telephone, but better yet, to actually go and talk to other human beings face to face, even with your mask on. And because there's something that's just completely different about that. And if you start thinking about what the world looks like to another person, try and imagine how the person you're speaking with might see things. Maybe they'll tell you if you're actually talking to them, or imagine in your mind's eye what the world would look like to someone in South Africa right now, or someone in Indonesia right now, and try and think about what they would be thinking. And I think you'll find a way to liberate yourself or to sneak up from behind yourself on axioms that you might have that prevent you from actually thinking clearly. And I think we can challenge people to do that. They shouldn't. That doesn't sound like a terribly oppressive thing to ask someone to try and think from the standpoint of someone else, or to go out and actually talk to other human beings in person, but it will make a big difference.
Okay, we have a question, Jason, for you. Zerny actually asked this question. Can you discuss what LaRouche means by natural law and its relevance to the truthful quality of man-made law?
Well, I know it's sort of my presentation, but to sort of maybe restate it, we're able to make laws that are false in the sense of not being helpful. So let's say you pass a law, and the effect of that law is to make people unhappy, make the economy worse, to, it's just wrong. It's a bad law. I'm sure we can all think of lots of examples of this. It's a law because we passed it, but it's not a natural law in the sense of a law of economics or physics or biology or these discovered laws. So I think when we think about making laws, we should think about discovering what should be a law. I mean, they have to be discoveries. Political thoughts are discoveries just like scientific ones are. And the laws that we pass in order to be in coherence with natural law have to relate to that discovery process and themselves contribute to expanding our ability to thrive and have more people and so on. Just one example on this is take the Green New Deal or the Great Reset or whatever it comes to be called soon. These ideas are basically taking as their foundation the axiom that human beings are destructive of nature, that resources are fixed, and that we are far exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet, certainly in terms of our resource usage. That's not true. It's just not true. We create resources. We use resources. Yes, we create resources. Many of the things that today are resources simply were not 1,000 years ago. Ores, raw earth elements, so on. So that's an example of laws that are perhaps passed through legislative consultation and executive approval and, through committees and whatever, all these trappings of the right way to create laws. And I'm not saying those things are wrong. The question is, what's the result? Is the result good or not? Is it a lawful law? And in the case of this green stuff, which is essentially saying that to prevent a calamity in the future, we need to cause one right now, laws that typically lay all of the responsibility on reducing CO2 rather than honestly appraising what might be the effect of a slightly changing climate and what would be the cost simply to improve our resilience to that. And I'll say on this, most of this idea of creating climate resilience is useful anyway. The number of people affected by and the loss in terms of percent of overall economic wealth of natural disasters is, it's like just a couple percent of what it was even 100 years ago. Not because the weather got better, but because we did. So, is it warmer? Well, let's make air conditioners. Is there a drought over here? Well, what can we do in terms of desalinating seawater with fusion? I mean, these are the kinds of investments we should be making anyway. And so that would be an example of, natural law would push us towards development and growth. A unlawful green law says, nope, we need to shut down, we're going to have fewer reliable energy sources, and the result of that is going to be fewer people, lower living standards. That is an unlawful law. An unnatural law.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so next question is this, and since it is the case that humanity is able to choose how and whether or not it wants to survive, and also that humans can manipulate, understand, and shape the world in their image, does this mean the principles and concepts that guide the universe can also be shaped in our image? In other words, can we create new principles that would not have existed if it weren't for humanity? Or are we just constantly unfolding an unending flow of principles? And if so, why?
Well, I think that gets at the relationship between creating and discovering. Let me first say something about this in culture and then come back on science. Did Beethoven create his Ninth Symphony, or did he discover it? Now, the specific notes, the specific music in that symphony, I presume everyone would agree he created that. He composed that. Is there something about his compositional technique that he discovered and which owes its authority not to his use of it, but to being in coherence with something universal about the human mind and human communication? In a certain sense, well, the Ninth Symphony has words, but a lot of this music, it's a discussion without words that can still be a reasonable one or a foolish one. It can be a creative one or a banal one. And I think in that field, you sort of see the contradiction, not the contradiction, the confrontation of these two ideas of discovery and creation, and how neither one is really everything. Same thing in science. None of our laws of science have truly been exactly right, ever. I mean, when Einstein developed his special and then general theories of relativity, that overturned completely, essentially, everything that we knew up till that time about physics. Much of it not in a profound way. Much of it, the changes are extremely small or essentially imperceptible. But you can't deny the fact that you could fairly say that everything we thought we knew was wrong. Not way off, but it wasn't right. So the authority of science then really is in this process of discovery. I think in this dialogue that we have with the universe through experimentation, the creation of new technologies that allow us then to pose more profound questions to nature by allowing us to delve more deeply and pose questions about the atom or the nucleus or the extremely large with things like the LIGO to detect gravity waves. Our technologies allow us to pose these new questions. And I think it's in that process of dialogue that the real authority is found. There is a truthful approach to that dialogue. Along the way, we are benefited by the fact that we come to an understanding that's less imperfect. Maybe we can say that instead of more true. That's less imperfect and that allows us to improve our potential population density. But were any of those principles actually a principle that governs the universe? Given that there's always been a little something wrong with them, I'm hesitant to say entirely that yes, that those principles are causes of nature. Although they are in that direction, they're an approximation, improving approximations towards it. But that the steps we make in this improvement are, definite ideas. So I think I would, I think that's what I would say. And that just one final thought, that this is the problem of science education. You teach some formula about, the coefficient of friction and the normal force on a surface, the potential force of friction will be that coefficient times the normal force, things like that. You get these things in school. Are they untrue? I mean, fundamentally, sort of, in the way I was just saying that, new discoveries will be made. But, even if they're right, even if they're steps in this road towards progress, what we're missing are the steps, the leaps, the jumps. So I think that there has to be and can be, and it'll also be so much more fun and rewarding, a fundamental change in the way we pursue education, especially in science and in math, but overall, to focus on those jumps and not, the spot where you land and then the spot where you land. Let's look at how we move forward.
Okay, well, there's a follow-up question. I'm going to direct this to both of you and Diane, which was, how do you know that the discovery made by Beethoven adheres to something that resonates with a pre-existing principle, rather than that it's a principle that was created the moment Beethoven composed his ninth? I'd just like to say something before either of you answer that. I think some people are aware that in the 1970s in particular, there was a particular obsession around the figure of Bach. It actually had started earlier. Bach and his music as being mathematically precise, etc. And this involved people who were involved in computer science in particular. Walter Carlos, who then became Wendy Carlos with his infamous switched on Bach of the mid-60s. But then there was a book written called Gödel, Escher, Bach, which tries to argue that the the architecture of Bach's music is a form of higher mathematics. And I just put this in because it takes us into a direction which we're probably going to have to deal with anyway over the course of the next period of time. Several of our members have had things to say about this in the past. Lyndon LaRouche had a lot to say about this. But I just wanted to throw that in. Not it necessarily inform the answers of right now, but it's an area that I think we're going to have to wade into and sort of blow up in order for people to really get a good idea of why you don't make computer calculations to tell you whether or not you can win a nuclear war, for example, or other such absurdities. So sorry about that. Just I wanted to editorialize a bit. So you want to go first, Jason, and then we'll see what Diane has to say about the same matter.
Oh, I was hoping that. Can I take a pass on this round and get Diane to go first?
Fine, right on.
I've got something to say. But...
Yeah, I'll go because I really have a specific idea. I think, one, the way that you know that you're not actually making a new principle is because it's possible to cause another human mind to have a flash of insight by working through that experiment, which means that it's a discovery of a pre-existing principle, which can also resonate in the mind of a distinct, discrete other human being. I think this process requires a great deal of humility, which I'm afraid we're terribly lacking in these days, because a good scientist will really take pleasure in recognizing that everything that we discover, even the thing that seems like the biggest breakthrough because it resolves a paradox that's really been bothering you for some time, will not be perfect. But as you grow into acting on the basis of that discovery, you will push your way along to another paradox, which then requires the next discovery. And actually, this is a most delightful process, but it's very hard for many of us in the way our society is constructed to take delight in the discovery that we are wrong. And that perhaps, I think this is a major assumption of people who believe in population reduction and limits to growth, is that somehow that all depends on the assumption that you've discovered everything there is to know about the universe already. You've discovered all the resources and you know exactly what people are going to do and what they're capable of. And if people would have a little more humility and consider that perhaps they actually don't know everything about the universe, perhaps we're equally as far from understanding the principles governing our universe as we were when the first person discovered the use of fire.
I'm gonna on the Beethoven thing. Let me take a slightly different approach here. Well, you might say I'm not answering the question, because I guess I'm not. But let's take another example of pedagogy, of teaching. So, if you've got something you're trying to convey, sometimes in the course of doing that, you think of a new way of getting it across. Maybe you create a new kind of, just as one example that's, I sure think of as, is creating, computer visualizations or interactive animations or something like this to help get across a concept, to help. I did this a lot with Kepler, with how Kepler had figured out how the planets moved in this. And, so you create things along the way to help people understand, the principle that Kepler arrived at. I don't think that what I made was a principle. I think it felt like a discovery or an insight or, a special way of getting something across, maybe like a poem, that you've got a discovery, you've got something to say. Did Beethoven create it? I just don't think it's an either or sort of thing. I think that there is something universal about what Beethoven created, which is the reason that people besides Beethoven are able to take profound joy and insight from his compositions. That wouldn't be possible if there wasn't something universal about it. That, hey, this is a great piece of music and it's accessible to everyone, has the potential to resonate with that. I will say, because you brought this book up, Dennis, this Gödel Escher Bach book. Okay, I didn't finish it. I got maybe half the way through it. And, what he had to say about Bach was kind of not that, was a bit disappointing. I will say, though, that the Gödel part was pretty, it's a very long book, but it was very pedagogical, I thought, because it has exercises and things. I found it really helpful if you're trying to figure out more about what Lynn was getting at in terms of how Bertrand Russell was the most evil man of the 20th century, and what Russell was trying to do with following up on Hilbert and the challenge of making all of mathematics logical. He does do a good job in that Gödel-Escher-Bach book of helping to understand, what would it mean to make mathematics into a logical system. And just personally speaking, I found it helpful for getting a sense of what that approach would mean. So it's my editorial comment on that book.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting thing for us to take a look at because, as I said, it's kind of gets you into an area. And there's a kind of final thing we'll do here. Actually, may as well move toward that because then I can make the same comment in this. Because as we're drawing to the conclusion, there's been several sort of allusions to what you brought up concerning Vernadsky and the idea of the biosphere. But I'll put it in a way which sort of can summarize some of these different remarks. There are three different layers: the geosphere, biosphere, and noosphere. Do these all have different laws? And if they do have different laws, how are they unified into a singular world? Which I think that question really just asks another question, which is why Vernadsky, what his importance was, and what your idea is for an upcoming symposium. What would the function of it be, particularly given, the kind of tensions that exist in the world today in the scientific community? Is this something that might be proposed as a way of shifting the entire frame of reference for at least a portion of humanity towards some kind of higher unity?
Well, that's great. So in terms of the geosphere, the abiotic, the biosphere, and the noosphere, do they have separate laws to address that part first? Well, yeah, they do. They're not entirely distinct, but there's different principles in them. So let's take an example of this. Right now, many people take completely on faith the idea that eventually our thinking process will be explained entirely by understanding the brain, the biological processes of the brain. And, people write books about this and say that MRI scans show that our brain is already having a thought before we consciously think of it, and things like this. Very uncompelling. The other huge leap of faith is that eventually biology will be explained by chemistry and hence by physics and so on. These aren't true. We can't explain all of biology in terms of chemistry, not right now. We can't explain cognition in terms of life or non-life. We haven't had the singularity event, right? We don't have AI, generalized intelligence. This we definitely don't have it yet. So there's a bit of a taking it on faith that eventually you would be able to. But instead look at it the other way. Look at where the abiotic fails to comprehend the biological. So one example would be symmetry. Why are dissymmetries in life why are dissymmetries found in life in a way that we don't find in the non-living? Why is it that for handed organic molecules, sugars, amino acids, things like this, why do they come in one of their stereoisomeric forms and not the other? What's the reasoning behind all of this? Why are living processes able to create this asymmetry that non-living ones don't? If you synthesize these from purely inorganic materials in the lab, you create one of these handed organic molecules, you always wind up with both stereoisomers. But in life, you get one of them. Okay? So a dissymmetric effect can only occur from a dissymmetric cause. This was one of the ideas of Pierre Curie, the less famous Curie, Marie's husband. Between cognition and the biological, you see a similarity, but also a huge difference. Over evolutionary time, biology creates what seem analogous to new technologies. We had mentioned earlier being warm-blooded, or the use of the technology of using extraterrestrial radiation, the sun, to power photosynthesis. over evolutionary time, we see these massive changes in the types of the range of elements used by living processes, in the types of biochemical reactions that living processes engage in the level of diversity, in the more self-directed nature of life. You know, animals in the sea moving from just being a sponge that hangs out to predators that actively seek out prey and can decide where to move. This is something that we see in the cognitive realm on a historical scale, on a very short scale, where a person in a moment makes a discovery, and that provides the power then to introduce a whole new range of technologies. So while I think it would be a safer thing to say that the cognitive does not disobey the laws of the biological, and that life does not disobey abiotic principles, that there simply exist biological principles that exist and will be known by us as biological rather than physical, and that there are principles about cognition that we will never be able to reduce to abiotic or life principles. Cognition itself, this resolution of paradoxes, it doesn't happen in a computer, in the abiotic. It won't. There is something similar about the process with our relationship to all of these domains and the process of discovery that we go through better to understand them. But I would, one of those universalities is about the nature of principle. So in this paper I had referenced by Lynn called Vernadsky and Dirichlet's principle, he talks about how Riemann had used the idea of Geistesmassen, of thought masses, as a way of understanding ideas, concepts, and the relationship of his use of Dirichlet's principle, which comes from potential theory, and it seems like it's this totally formal mathematical thing, but not to Lynn or to Riemann. That Lynn says this is a very powerful rubric for our ability to focus on what a principle is. So I think that's something that these different domains have in common through us, through our participation in coming better to know them. On the Vernadsky Conference, which I hope we'll be able to have more to announce about soon, to take place sometime in the very late summer, early fall. So Vernadsky, being of Ukrainian and Russian cultural heritage, we are in touch with scientists both in Ukraine and Russia who are admirers of this great man, following in the tradition of his work, that this provides not only something very, you might say, very politically unique right now, considering the crisis in Ukraine, but also something very profound about thinking through what economics is by this very different natural scientist's approach to the effects of human life, which comes sort of from the other side of LaRouche's ideas about economics and the science of the human mind, where together I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to really think through the basis of economics and economic policy, and and what I think what development is, as well as specific development projects and proposals. So it's what I'm thinking about it so far, and we really do need to get to work on hammering this out and making it more specific and moving forward on it.
Yeah, well, as we go to a conclusion, I just like to say that maybe one way for us to think about it is that this idea of this economic and development, a security and development architecture, has to have a component like this of a discussion process, which, for the peculiar reasons of what Vernadsky himself was involved in from a research standpoint, what his role was in the former Soviet Union, and so on, might have another kind of implication. But Diane, I just wanted to see if you have any thoughts either about that symposium, or more importantly, of course, we have another conference which is about to come up. It's on April 9th, which the Schiller Institute is doing. Maybe you could say a bit about that and how people can work and participate with that.
Well, as you said, this conference will be April 9th, and it really flows from the appeal written by Helga Zepp-LaRouche for a new security and development architecture modeled on the Treaty of Westphalia, which was not merely what I guess you'd call a political agreement of not acting against the interests of any nation, but acting in the interests of your neighbors, but the economic policy that went with that. And clearly, we have to get to a higher level. And I think that is in the domain of having a sense of what it means to discover new universal principles, that if we were actually working together on these questions, like China just figured out how to grow rice in salt water, which will greatly increase the ability to feed people, or figuring out how to detect asteroids and comets, which are headed toward the Earth, one of which might hit us, and that would eliminate the need for further discussion on these topics. I mean, we really don't seem to do a very good job of finding these things. We keep hearing about them, and you only get a couple days' notice. We're going to have to do better at that if we want to make sure that we're here to do the other things. So I think this potential dialogue, this conference April 9th, will be extremely important. And my understanding is that while this one will be virtual, there is hope that it will be merely a prelude to one where people can hopefully meet in person. We'll see how the pandemic is doing. But I think we should not let up for a minute, no matter how things appear on the surface in terms of the war and the war danger and the collapse. There has to be a voice, as Jason said earlier, of where mankind should be going. And I think we will find that we can pull people together on that basis, even if we have many disagreements on major issues of principle in the present.
Jason, before I ask you for any summary remarks, actually, there's a question here which may give you the opportunity to do that. It's I don't know who wrote it actually, but I just got it. Oliver Stone has a report on NATO expansion in the neo-Nazi military in Ukraine as a result of the 2014 coup with Victoria Nuland, etc. It says, I only saw a clip but didn't see anything about the Great Reset, the Green New Deal's fraudulent call to save the earth from mankind's development, and I didn't see anything like the World Land Bridge. With India joining Russia and China as well as others, can we expect more Western forces for the good to join with LaRouche's 4 laws? So that's the question, and I just figure you can probably use that as the occasion for a kind of wrap up.
Well, this is this points to the unique importance of the Schiller Institute, of the LaRouche movement, is that, security, and Helga Zepp-LaRouche has had, fights with leaders about this, world leaders about this, that you cannot have security without a plan for the future, without a development initiative, without a development orientation. So, Oliver Stone in his video, I think he had a scope of what he was going for with Ukraine on fire. And, and that's what, he also, I don't think he was the direct, anyway, he had an idea of, that video had an intent of what it was going to get across, and it focused on that intent. It didn't get into absolutely everything into the world. I think we do have an obligation to paint that broader picture, that the Green New Deal is another side of, it's the exact same side as the global war policy. So the attempts to box Russia in, to destroy it, the expansion of NATO, the coup in Ukraine that put this, these Nazi-linked forces in power directly in the government, all of this tension that it creates on the border of Russia, the pivot towards Asia, the increasingly confrontational approach towards China to prevent the sovereignty and independence of these nations from being expressed. This is the other side of that coin is the Green New Deal, is promoting policies that will hinder, restrict development, like in the EU, where they're trying to take, not just the EU, taking land out of cultivation, cutting back on fertilizer use, cutting back on pesticide use. It is possible to overuse pesticides and fertilizer, but the real goal and the effect behind these policies is going to reduce the potential population density of the planet. It's to kill people. It's a depopulation, it's a Malthusian argument. So you cannot defeat war while clinging to and being guided by a Malthusian outlook. Say, oh, no, we can't have a war. We shouldn't kill others. We should all kill ourselves by shutting down our industries and our potential to support ourselves. So breaking out of both of those is truly required. And, although the actions that Russia is taking right now are extremely direct in terms of literally breaking through that wall, I think we've seen things that are a bit more diplomatic on the green front, which I agree is an issue, the extent to which I think some of these views really are held, or these axioms are spreading even in these pro-development countries like Russia or China or India. Nonetheless, if you look at the actions, what their feet are doing, I think that there is a clear recognition. Like India, for example, has been extremely clear. They will not sacrifice development to achieve green goals. Not going to happen. They're saying this is our choice. This is where we stand on this issue. So this is the, I don't have one to hold up right now, but the LaRouche organization's latest pamphlet, which you can get at larouche.org/stopwar, larouche.org/stopwar. This pulls together the picture here. Global Britain, the green stuff, the threat of nuclear war through direct military confrontation. We pull this picture together and combine that with a path forward, the exit ramp towards that better future of development and growth that has to be the active peace, the structure of the peace that we achieve. Peace is not an absence of war. Peace needs structure and intention.
Okay, so Jason Ross, Diane Sayre, thank you very much for what you've just done. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and of course urge people to get involved with helping to organize that conference for April 9th. That's only 3 weeks away. We have a petition also that we have online to convoke an international conference for a new security and development architecture. And we invite you both to sign it and to circulate it. To conclude, I just want to read a few words from Lyndon LaRouche's The Historical Individual, which was written in the year 2002. And it is Lynn describing the relationship between statecraft and art, or politics as art. He says, "So in life, as on the classical stage, so does the truly great statesman do as Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt did. And so did the historical sublime Joan of Arc or Reverend Martin Luther King. When such real-life actors as these appeared no more on the transient stage, the soul of such exceptional leaders lived on unseen, immortal, more powerful in death than in life before. The classical artist, as actor or composer, is a copy of such exceptionally great political leaders as those. He or she is a model who teaches the people and their proper leaders the art of imparting to the imagination of an audience what the poet Shelley identified as profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. It is by this same standard required for the exceptional political leader that the performance of that artist as an artist is to be judged." That's it for today.